Ahoy, and welcome to Titanic Talkline. I am Alexia, and I am excited to introduce this week's guest. We have Bradley Harper, whose name just got stuck in my throat real bad. I'm so sorry. Who is an author that has a keen interest in comics and Titanic, two things that I particularly enjoy. So I am very excited to have you. Hello.
Well, hello, Alexia. Thank you for having me on today. So, how did you like that comic book?
I really liked it. For those who don't know, Bradley gave me a copy of his comic that is not Titanic related. That's more of like a noir, like old style. I'm having a hard time coming with the words to describe it. Kind of like,
Gothic?
yeah, gothic. That's the one that I wanted. Like for some reason, vampires coming into my mind, but there's like not really a vampire involved. But like that feeling.
Oh,
It's like
thank you. I'm glad you enjoyed it. It was
I did.
a poem that I wrote some time back when I was going through a
Excuse
rough
me.
patch in my life, and I find that my best poetry is when I'm depressed. It's a way for me to kind of externalize how I feel, and I can look at it and deal with it better. And then I had it made into a comic book, and then that comic book I made into an animation, and it's been winning awards at festivals around the world. It just got selected the Atlanta Horror Fest. None of this is Titanic related. I
No, but it's still
apologize
cool.
for that detour, but since you mentioned the comic book, I just thought I'd bring that up. Okay, let's segue now to the
Yes, to
Titanic.
are we ready to go back to Titanic?
Yeah.
So what is your Titanic story? If it doesn't have to do with, dark gothic comic books.
Well, as you said, an author. I have two books out. My third novel is coming out next Monday. That would be September the 18th. I'm not sure when this is playing, but
After
September the
that, so
18th.
anyone who's listening, please go ahead and get a copy of.
Reflections in a Dragon's Eye.
Oh, tell me about that. I know it's probably not Titanic, but it sounds cool, so please tell me.
Well, thank you. Yeah, it's a modern day police procedural. I'm a retired Army pathologist, and
Oh, wow.
and I've done about 200 autopsies, and I've also done about 20 forensic death investigations, and I wanted to. So I use that in my writing. So the book that's coming out on Monday, that's I there's a condition called conditional dependent learning. Sometimes when people are very drunk or very high, they encode a memory they can only recall when they return that physiologic state. So I have a guy who sees a body dumped when he's drunk, and then afterwards can't recall exactly where it was, and the police finally decide that they need to take him back to the where he's in the area where the body was discovered and get him drunk. And the problem is, since the time he saw it, he's become a recovering alcoholic. So, you're willing to put the man's sobriety at risk on the chance that he helps them figure out who the killer is. So again, that's off topic. How I got into Titanic? Okay, now we're there. Uh, my
I mean,
first
to
two
be
books were
perfectly
both
honest with
historical
you,
fiction.
I
The
love true
first book I
crime.
put Arthur Conan Doyle on the hunt for Jack the Ripper. It was called A Knife in the Fog. It was an Edgar finalist, translated into Japanese, and the
Oh,
audiobook won
cool.
an award. And I'm working with a director right now in London. We're working on an adaptation. So my agent proposed for my third book that I write something set aboard the Titanic. So I like crime. Obviously, my first two books both are historical fiction slash crime, and
Hmm.
so the thought I had was on this one I discovered a gang of all female thieves that was called the 40 Elephants, and they operated from around 1780 to 1953 out of a pub called the Elephant and Castle, hence the name the 40 Elephants.
Sure.
And at the time of the Titanic sailing, the leader was a woman named Mary Carr, who also worked as an artist model because she had a very long and elegant neck. She was also called Swan Neck.
Oh,
So she was the leader at the time, and I have her and a couple of her associates on board the Titanic to steal a painting by the artist Blondel that was on board and went down with the ship. And opposing them, I have a young man named Harry Worth. Harry Worth is the son of Adam Worth, and Adam Worth was a real person. He was the inspiration for Sherlock Holmes' nemesis, Professor Moriarty. Adam Worth was a consulting criminal. He would plan other people's heists, and then he would get like 15% of the take. And a large estate in England. He had a steam yacht. He had a stable of racehorses, and so he certainly put the lie to crime doesn't pay. Well, late in life, he finally got caught for a bank job, and when he got out, he was in poor health and didn't have much money. So he approached William Pinkerton, the head of the Pinkerton Detective Agency, and said, "Look, I have this painting you've been contracted to recover. I'll let you have it on condition that, number one, you don't prosecute me. Number two, you give me $25,000. And third, when my son comes of age, I want you to make him a Pinkerton agent because I don't want him to follow me into a life of crime." So I have the son of a master criminal playing a cat and mouse game with these female thieves on board the Titanic. And oh, by the way, they also discover there was a book, a very expensive book that was had been sold at auction that had over 1,000 diamonds embedded in it. It was a copy of Omar Khayyam's The Rubaiyat, and it also went down with the ship. So they learn about this book, so they decide to steal the book, remove all the gems, and then put the book back, because figuring it won't be discovered till they're all in New York and they can get off with it. So I've got two items actually, and Alfred Hitchcock made a term called a MacGuffin. And a MacGuffin is the item that drives the story. And the Maltese Falcon, it's the statuette. Raiders of the Lost Ark, it's the Ark of the Covenant. Mm-hmm. So in this story, I actually have two MacGuffins. I have this book and I have this painting by Blondel. The Blondel painting was a Circassian woman walking out of a Roman bath naked, and was highly, it was estimated to be worth around 100,000 pounds. And the owner finally got 60,000 pounds for it when the ship went down, and it was estimated that today's money would be worth about $2.5 million.
Wow, that's incredible. What, for people who don't know, what is the title of the book if they want to grab it?
Okay, well, it's not out yet. I'm pitching it right now to various agents and publishers. The title is Maiden Voyage: Love and Larceny Aboard the Titanic. I completed a master's in creative writing last year at Napier University in Edinburgh, Scotland. I lived in Scotland for 8 months, and the last trimester I did online back in the States. So this novel was my thesis project. And so I had to have, I think, the first 50 pages as well as a synopsis for the entire work in order to complete the program. And so after I completed, I continued to work on it. And I just now have it ready to start pitching.
That's so cool. I mean, and also to what you were saying about sorry for the detraction, true crime is one of my personal fascinations. So please never apologize for talking about true crime, because I will listen eagerly. I have an incredible fascination, especially with how things have developed. And, to loop things back to Titanic, because that's technically what the shows are about. It's fascinating just to watch the world of forensic technology changing over even just the past 5 to 10 years, and seeing what we're able to now discover that was basically unfathomable 20 plus years ago.
Oh, yeah. I do a talk to Sherlock Holmes societies and forensic or crime writers, I should say. I call Sherlock Holmes a science fiction. And all the techniques that Doyle has his detective use were not in existence at that time. For example, at one point, Holmes says he has this database of like 34 different tire types, and no one had a database like that. That allowed him, the detective, to look at an unknown, compare it to knowns, and determine what type of tire made that track. And nobody had anything like that at the time. And so later on, a French gentleman who studied both law and medicine used the Holmes stories as inspiration to form the world's first crime lab in Lyon, France. And there's a very famous story where he used to prove the worth of such scientific investigation using scientific principles to solve crime. Because before then, crimes were solved basically by eyewitnesses, confessions, and alibis. And those were the three major tools that detectives had. Well, even the word detective is interesting. It comes from the Latin word detegere, which means to unroof or to expose. And so the purpose of the detective is to expose the truth, to expose evil or crime. And so just the whole idea of using scientific methods, objective evidence to determine guilt was a radical idea.
It's really interesting. I talk about this on almost any episode that I do, which is that viewing the Titanic story, any historical story, but specifically in this context, Titanic, from our modern day lens is both fortunate and unfortunate because so many things that were just normal at the time will never happen again. And it's hard to understand those sorts of contexts, things like how strong the invisible class barriers were, or how actually that's the biggest example I can think of. Never mind. That's the end of the sentence.
Well, you are right. I'm very fortunate that I was living in the UK at
Mm-hmm.
the time I was doing my research on this because when I was able to visit the Titanic Museum in Belfast and the Maritime Museum in Southampton, the bulk of the crew came from Southampton. And
Right.
whereas the museum is not totally dedicated to the Titanic, there's a huge section of it that is, and they have a wonderful display. One of the things that struck me, there's a large map of Southampton at the time of 1912 when the ship sailed, and every household that had a crew member aboard, there's a red dot, and the floor is covered in these red dots. It was said that there wasn't a child in the public schools in Southampton who either didn't have a family member involved or had a friend or some classmate. It really was a heavy blow to the entire community. So many people died at one time
Mm-hmm.
from this relatively small city.
I just learned the other day, again, nothing to do with Titanic, but I was younger when Hurricane Katrina hit. Not to randomly take us back to 2005 for no reason. There's a point to this. And I was listening to a podcast that I really enjoy called My Favorite Murder, and one of the hosts, Karen, her story for that week was discussing Charity Hospital in New Orleans. And I learned a lot of astonishing facts about what happened in the immediate aftermath of Hurricane Katrina. But one of the facts that I guess I know I'd heard it sometime, but had probably forgotten because it's been almost 20 years, 18 years since the Hurricane Katrina, is that it decimated about 25% of the population of New Orleans, and it has not recovered since. And it's hard to think about things like you're just discussing with the loss of sailors in Southampton, where you're saying, there there were so many households that had sailors, and just when something like this literally comes in and just wipes out a significant portion of it, it's exceptionally hard to recover from that, not just societally or economically, but also literally in terms of population recovery. It's a very long road forward.
Yeah, one of the touching on that, one of the big challenges in World War II, they had high casualty rates among bomber crews, and they
Hmm.
quickly found it was important that the next morning they have replacements sitting in the empty seats at the mess hall. If the bomber crews, after a rough night, if they lost, say, three or four planes with their crews, if they came back the next morning, they would look at all these empty seats, and that was right staring in their face, reminding them of how likely it was that they were going to be lost in the next mission. So keeping those seats filled to pretend that everything was normal was very important to keep the morale up of these crews that had the highest casualty rates of any particular occupation in the war.
That's a very sad fact. I thought I had more to say about that, but it's interesting to be so cognizant of the fact, like, there will be a visible sense of loss for these young men. They'll see it. They have eyes. They can see. Um, but at the time, our resources then were different. But at the time, they were like, well, instead of doing something about it, just fill it in. Everyone smile. It's fine.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Uh, I'm fortunate, although I served 37 years in the Army, I never went to war. I actually volunteered to go to Iraq, to the Green Zone.
Oof.
Uh, Afghanistan, I'm sorry, to the Green Zone, and at the last minute was substituted for a more junior officer. The senior officer there found out I would actually technically outranked him, and he didn't want a senior doctor in the back ranks and had me pulled, and they sent somebody else. But yeah, but I've dealt with that. I've sent lots of soldiers into combat and helped many to come back. And I think war is about the stupidest human enterprise I can imagine. Sorry, but the loss of life with the Titanic in that community was equivalent, I guess, to a bombing raid on say Dieppe in World War II. You know, it was just devastating, and they remember to this day. Uh,
Mhm.
One of the interesting things, the Titanic conference where we met in Las Vegas,
Yes.
was hearing the stories of some of the descendants of the survivors. Really made it more personal to me. There's the history that's in books, and there's the histories in families. It makes it much more real than in some sort of a history book. And I really appreciated those stories an awful lot. I remember one that struck me. A lady said that her grandmother was one of the survivors, and as the Carpathia was approaching, the sun wasn't up yet, and they were terrified that the ship was going to hit them,
Hmm.
blundering about in the dark. And this woman had letters that she'd written to her daughter and set them on fire so they could wave the burning letters up in the air with hopes that the ship would see them and not run over them. Um, so I've never been in that kind of situation, but just imagine that everything you've been through already, the lives that you saw lost, and the voices calling out in the darkness, and then think at the last minute you might die as well. Now, many of the survivors on board the Carpathia couldn't sleep below decks. They were so
Hmm.
afraid, and they had to be given sleeping potions to help go to sleep because because it was still going through bad weather. It was going through ice for quite a while after their rescue, and that sense of hyper alertness just wouldn't fade away, and they had their own form of PTSD.
Hmm. I've had a couple strange, nothing, I've never been like close to death in a shipwreck, but I think we've all had some sort of harrowing experience that it makes it difficult to sleep the next night. And I'm just trying to think, if I went through something related like Titanic, they would need to give me opiates at the minimum and probably keep me swaddled in a blanket. Just that sounds like I'm joking, but I'm not. Where it's just, I'd be so afraid of being cold.
Yeah,
Like I'd
yeah,
be paranoid of being cold. It'd be like it wouldn't matter if I was overheating or sweating. It'd be like, no, you can't take this blanket off. I'm going to freeze. I'm going to freeze to death if if you leave me alone. And
well, all I
I
can
do
say
talk
is
about that kind of stuff. Ugh.
yeah, they'd have to give me a pretty generous drink allowance to get me back on board a ship. That's for sure.
Yeah, some of the one of the many privileges of doing my show has been I have gotten to talk to some um survivors and descendants, and there's been a number of stories that surprised me, and one of them was I just talked to Ivan Fleming the other week, and he was telling me about how his mother was not only rescued by the Carpathia, but shortly after took a voyage back to the UK aboard it.
Ah,
Yeah, and I just remember thinking, like, I don't know if I'd be able to do that. I mean,
yeah,
maybe if I really had to, it would just be one of those things where you kind of got to like take a deep breath and just, all right, this is what I have to do. I'm going to have to do it, but it would be very hard.
yeah, yeah. I can't imagine what the feelings she must have had getting back aboard that ship. All the memories that she would have of that of being loaded onto that ship. That'd be tough. That's one tough person, is all I can say.
Agree that I don't know that I have the constitution to do that, but I've talked to a few people on my show also about trauma and how a lot of members of crew and a lot of in particular, but then also a lot of survivors of Titanic don't exactly have happy lives afterwards.
Yeah. If okay, I'm going to make a tangential reference here, but trust me, it'll get back to your point. The gentleman who used the Sherlock Holmes stories as a inspiration for crime labs, he came up with what he called the contact principle, and he said no two solid objects can come into contact with one another without each leaving some trace upon the other. In other
Sure.
words, a criminal can't leave the crime scene without some trace of the scene being left on them and without them leaving some trace of themselves behind. I
Mhm.
think also events in our lives, significant people, significant interactions we have with other people, those also leave a trace in our lives, which can sometimes even go on to succeeding generations. So that contact principle, and again, the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, that the observer becomes part of the phenomena. We are all interconnected, and there's no way that something like that can happen to you without there being some trace, some residual effect that will be with you for the rest of your life.
I think that holds true. There's, people talk a lot about things like, trauma responses, and what that really, often boils down to is reacting to things that happen in your past that, have an impact to you still today. And that holds true, and that important moments don't just leave you untouched. Good and bad moments, people often remember particular highs and particular lows in life, which is, it's a good thing on the one hand. You do want to be able to remember really, really good moments in your life, but it also means that there's the propensity to very strongly remember things that impact you terribly.
Yeah. Well, our brain is hardwired to keep us alive.
Hmm.
And so it's always looking for the risk, for the danger to us. And so the events in our lives which are painful or uncomfortable, the brain's going to fix on that more avidly because it's going to look for a lesson on how can I use this to protect myself from the future. Whereas the happy moments, we bask in the moment, and they certainly leave pleasant memories, but the images, the memories usually aren't as strong as those moments that the brain can use for future risk avoidance.
Is that something that you found in your, past forensics work? Can I call it forensics work?
Yeah, and well,
Okay.
yes. In fact, part of my part of my master's program in Scotland, we had to come up with a some talk because the majority of us, although we all wanted to be writers, a lot of people, if they want to pay their bills, they wind up teaching. And so I had to come up with a lesson plan on some aspect of teaching writing. And so I looked how the brain acquires and processes information, and I looked at the senses primarily, uh, and the olfactory sense is the strongest of the five, strongest by the other four go up to the cerebral cortex and are processed. The olfactory nerve runs along the nasal sinus and goes straight to the reptilian brain, the animal brain at the base of the brain, and that keys into the amygdala, and the amygdala has very strong emotions: feeding, fighting, fleeing, and sexual procreation. So if I tell people, if you want to write a scene that puts the reader into it, use smell, and that will give them a very strong image in their mind. So what I'm trying to say is that uh, we are biologic animals, creatures, and emotion is very tightly tied to our intellect. It's very hard to be totally dispassionate, like Spock. Even just looking at the order of the universe, you get a sense of awe and a sense of how small you are. So I think that we're all very emotional driven,
Mhm.
even at our driest and most intellectual, and we would be foolish to disregard how our emotions drive the things that we look for, the things we learn, and how our brain utilizes information.
To bring this back to Titanic in a very odd way, like, I think that Titanic in particular has a very particular, to use the same word twice, draw for people in a way that other times and things and events don't have. Well, not all, but many don't have. And it does seem to trigger some kind of response in people. What do you think that's about? Why do you think that is?
Well, I think it's the same reflex as when people drive by a bad car accident. You don't want to look, but you can't help but do it. And again, I think the brain is saying, how can I keep this from happening to me? What lessons can I learn from these other people's misfortune? And it was, as in my experience as a physician, I've sat on risk management boards and I look at um, medical disasters where there was a terrible outcome. And my experience has been it's usually not just one thing going wrong; it's a series of failures that go wrong. And how can you learn from that to prevent it from happening in the future?
Why do you think Titanic in particular has such like a romantic lens to it? Because I mentioned that I like true crime. So I watch forensic files, I listen to podcasts related to it, but I would in no way consider that to be a romantic pastime of mine. It's an informative thing, but I don't think about it with any tone of rosiness or optimism. It's as I mentioned, it's purely informative. But for many people, they look back at Titanic or they look at the legend, what has now become like almost legend and lore, with this very whimsical view.
Well, I think it's the cast of characters. You had some of the richest people on earth. They were truly the very apex of the society of their time. They were living a very elegant lifestyle. You had a fashion designer, a multimillionaire, a movie actress, uh, people that were greatly admired, and yet at that moment they were just as human as anyone else. So the feeling that that kind of commonality that at the end of the day, no matter how rich you are, how glamorous you are, we're all subject to this. You're all subject to Mother Nature, and none of us are intrinsically better suited or better or different than anyone else. So I think it's that sense that that commonality that we're in essence we're all the same, and that the Titanic is an objective lesson in that truth.
Do you think that's also partially why so many people are interested in true crime now?
I think so. Back in the days, think of the grim fairy tales. Well, the scariest thing was going off into the forest. This is when people lived in small villages, and the forest was right there. So it was
Yeah,
a way to make sure the children didn't go wandering off. There are
true.
monsters in that forest which might, put you in the oven and cook you. So it was a way of avoiding having a next generation avoid doing dangerous things. I think we need monsters. I think we all need monsters. We need something to be afraid of. That rustling sound under the bed, that dark shape in the closet, something to bring balance to our life to counter. We need light, but I think also we need some dark to make us cautious.
There is a book that people reference a lot that I have not personally read yet. It's one of, I have a to read list a mile long, but this one is called, it's by Gavin de Becker. It's called The Gift of Fear: Survival Signals That Protect Us from Violence. And it's a self-help book that teaches or encourages people to embrace the gut instinct and not to ignore that, well, gift of fear.
Hmm.
And I think that
Yeah,
goes along with what
our
you're saying
brain.
about needing monsters.
Yeah. We are conscious of only about 3 to 5% of of our environment. Our subconscious is soaking in all this peripheral information that we're not consciously aware of, and that intuition, and a change in a person's inflection, their body posture, how they lean towards you, anything, little things like that we're not consciously aware of, and yet our subconscious has learned to associate that with dangerous behavior or certainly warning signals. And so
Yeah.
I am a big believer in listening to your gut, and the intuition, and being fat, dumb, and happy is great if you're a rabbit. You know, mind being the next meal for a hawk.
Yeah, I figure I'd rather look silly in the near future than dead.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
mean, it's just better to be safe, and I think that that's super valuable. But I know that there are a lot of people, especially, people that are in situations where they're, the victims of domestic violence or so, where it's not super easy to do that sort of thing. But,
Yeah.
if you are in a position where you're able to, it's definitely wise to listen to those feelings that are telling you that what's happening is just not good.
Yeah. Well, in my first two books, I had one of my major characters was a a woman. So to write her dialogue convincingly, to write her inner thoughts convincingly, I had to think very hard, especially in the 19th century, when women had less power even than they have now. And one quote that I read from a woman, I can't remember now who it was, but she said, most men, when they meet a woman, are afraid that she'll laugh at him.
Mm,
A lot of women, when they meet a man, are afraid that he will kill them.
yeah.
And
And,
I think
it's a lot.
Yeah, and I think that shows the power discrepancy between the two, because men tend to be larger and stronger and more physically aggressive than women are, and so men are not as aware of how an environment might appear threatening to a woman because they've got that masculine body habitus and that shield and the sense of entitlement that oh, this can't happen to me.
Yeah, I'm not a very big person. I'm 5'5", but I do play roller derby, and I have a big personality. So I think many people, when they look at me, the thought is, oh yeah, she can handle herself. And none of my partners that I've dated, my male partners, have ever been like big guys. They've all been taller than me. They've like 5'10" or 5'11" or so, but and neither of them have in any way ever been violent towards me. But if it had come to it, like if we had ended up in a boxing ring for some reason, they could take me. They're just bigger. They are both
Yeah,
faster than I am. Even though I'm the one that exercises, I'm the one that routinely slams into people. That's me. But they're faster than I am, and again, they could get my arms in a way where I couldn't reach them. There's so many little advantages that they would have over me, where it's like, could I win? Yeah, sure. It would take a lot more effort though, and maybe that's just because I'm a terrible fighter. That maybe that's the reason, but I'm being realistic about myself.
yeah,
Just me. There's other people that might be like, that would never happen to me, and I'm very happy for you, but me, I'm not that sort of tough. And it's that inherent knowledge of, well, should this ever go badly, it would be for me.
yeah,
You'd be
yeah.
fine.
And of course, as a physician working in the emergency room, I saw many
Mm.
examples of women that were physically abused by their partners. So
I
yeah,
don't know
okay. And
how
this is a
you
direction.
ugh.
Yeah,
No,
this is a
all I was
direction. I'm sure you. Yeah, I'm sorry.
No, I was gonna say is I'm not I very much applaud you for the work that you have done. There's a lot of, it takes a lot of stomach to do things, to work with victims of any sort, because they've been through a lot, and being sensitive to that is important. So it's nice to hear you talk about people with that level of kindness and empathy and consideration.
Oh, well, thank you. I can tell you that my wife has been a great teacher to me. At one point, when we were stationed over in Germany, I was a deputy commander for the hospital. So people come to me all day long with their problems. It's my job to fix them. I come home and she starts telling me her problems at work, and I try to fix them, and she gets frustrated. I got frustrated. And finally, after this went on for a month or so, I suddenly realized she didn't want me to fix her problems.
Hmm.
She just wanted me to listen.
Yeah.
And yeah, that sounds very obvious to you, but let me tell you, for me, that was like a major life-changing insight that she wasn't talking to the deputy commander of the hospital. She was talking to her husband. And
Yeah.
I had to shift gears. I had to change my role as being the problem solver to just an empathetic listener who cared how she felt and how her problems were affecting her.
I learned that when I volunteered for the Trevor Project, which is a crisis chat and hotline for queer youth in the United States. And one of the first things they teach you during your training is the difference between sympathy and empathy. And part of it was, as you were saying, learning to listen to the problem because, and I think this is the wording I'm stealing from a YouTuber um, therapist named Jonathan Decker. I think he says that it's, if you listen to their, to their emotions and to their what's going on with them, they will usually take care of the problem. It's usually something that they can or should handle. They just want to have someone help them deal with what they're feeling so that they can then go and tackle the issue.
One of the ways my wife helps me write is I'm having a problem with the story. A lot of times, as I'm explaining it to her, the solution will come to me. But externalize it, if I have to think really hard how to explain it to someone else, that forces me to analyze that problem in a different way, a different pathways in my brain or something. And by
Mm.
externalizing it like that, it helps me to see it objectively or at arm's length. And usually by the time I finish explaining the problem, I know what the next step should be.
That often happens to me as well. Like if someone just gives me the opportunity to talk through whatever is bothering me, usually that helps me get that initial whatever responses out of the way. And then I start literally just talking myself through solving my own problem. It's very rare that I actually need someone to completely come in and solve it for me. I'll usually work it mostly out by myself,
Yeah.
but it helps to
Okay.
have
So
somebody.
going back to the Titanic, I'm sorry, I've led you far afield, but two of my favorite real life people. First of
Yes.
all, is Margaret Brown.
Of course, a
She was
classic.
just well, one of the things I found out in my research is that she boxed for fitness. She didn't spar, but she worked a heavy bag, and yeah, that was
That's
a
so
thing at
cool.
that time for yeah, yeah. And so I used that in my story. At one point, there was a guy who passed himself off as a baron, and he was a big phony. And once they were on the Carpathia, he crawled on top of a pile of blankets. So I have Margaret Brown and Mary Carr team up together, and they throw the guy off the blankets and beat the crap out of him, so
Excellent.
they can get the blankets to other people. I can see Margaret Brown doing that. And one of the things that struck me when the Carpathia arrived, they had to debark by ticket class. So the first class passengers got off first, then the
Hmm.
second, then the third. Well, Margaret Brown did not leave the dock until she made sure every third class passenger had some place to spend the night. That shows the quality of the person that she was. And
Hmm.
she's in the story. Obviously, I couldn't keep someone like that out. The other
No.
person is Charles Lightoller, the second officer, the senior officer who survived. And I was fascinated to learn if you saw the movie Dunkirk, they have one character. They never name him, but he has this boat, and he and his son and a Sea Scout go across and help to the evacuation. Well, that was Charles Lightoller. His little motor yacht, the Sundowner, usually carried up to about 25 or so people. Well, he and his son and another young man went across in the little boat flotilla and rescued 130 soldiers from death or capture. And I just thought, and I wrote that as an epilogue to the book, because I have him at one point. He's watching the people drown.
Mm.
He made it to this overturned collapsible, and he's with one of my main characters, and they're watching all of the death and destruction. And so this is kind of a redemption for Lightoller all those years later, when he's able to do something to save people after he was helpless to do anything when the ship sank.
Yeah, I don't remember how I initially learned that he assisted with the evacuation at Dunkirk, but it was a fact that somebody told me a while ago. I thought it was super cool how, the Venn diagrams of history overlap.
It is. It is. And he was 66 years old at that time. And so it took an awful lot of courage to do that, but he was a proper British officer. And World War One, he had two commands. He rammed a German submarine at one point in his
Hmm.
destroyer, and so he was a guy, and of course, even before the Titanic, he had an exciting life. He mined gold in Alaska for a while. He was a cattle wrangler. At one point, a ship he was serving on sank off the coast of Brazil, and he lived on an island for 8 days before a passing ship saw his campfire. So, I mean, this guy had a very full life.
Wow, what Lifetime movie is based off of him? I think we need one or a mini series. Where's Netflix? Get on this.
Yeah, yeah, you could probably have like three movies about his life, all the things that he did.
You should do a mini series. Just call it Light Toller. Have it be like 9 episodes, just of his crazy life going through every single main, what not every, but like most major disasters in a 50-year period.
Oh yeah, I also have Violet Jessup. You know
Yeah.
the stewardess was on each of the three Olympic class ships, and was on the Britannic when it rammed. It was rammed by another ship on the
Hmm.
Titanic, of course, and then excuse me, on the Britannic when it hit the mine, rather the Olympic when it rammed the ship, and the Titanic when it sank. And
Hmm.
I made a comment as if I was getting on board a ship and I saw her there, I'd try to get off. But
Yep.
if I didn't find out she was on board until the ship had left port, I'd stay as close to her as possible because she survived all three of those disasters. I read her memoir, and
Mhm.
she was a pretty interesting lady.
I'm sure she is, but I have to admit that if I were one of her friends, I would be super suspicious of her after the third time. It'd be like, I need to talk to you, Violet, because every ship you've been on's kind of had a big thing happen to it just while you were on it. That's the thing.
Yeah.
Not accusing you. I just have questions. Don't need to be so angry. No, it's just it's so crazy to think that that would just uh, that just happens. I think after the second time I was in a literal shipwreck, I would stop going on ships.
Yeah. Well, she made very good money, and the thing in her memoir, the thing she liked is, yeah, unlike most women in her day, when she
Hmm.
was ashore, she was free. I mean, she
Hmm.
had her own money. She wasn't dependent on a man. She could do what she wanted to do. She was free to come and go as she pleased. She got to see the world, and so she felt that it was a very good lifestyle for her. Plus, she was able to support her aging mother and help put her younger brothers through school. So I mean, it was a good life for her.
I think you bring up something pretty important there, which is that for women who are unattached, there were very few opportunities if you weren't like Violet and had your own money. And because earning money was difficult, there were very few jobs for women. And the ones that there were, just, even if you could get one, they just didn't pay very much.
Yeah, yeah. Governess,
Yeah.
secretary, seamstress. Yeah, all
Kitchen
were.
workers,
Yeah.
things like that. Or you could get, if you were even poorer, you could be stable hands, but you'd earn less than your male counterparts.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
It was
Uh,
difficult. So that's a fair point.
go, yeah. Yeah. So that was a pretty good lifestyle. Sort of like airplane stewardesses today, I guess.
Hmm.
Or excuse me, flight attendants. I think that's the right word now. Although they were called stewardesses back in the day, and it was interesting to me that one of their jobs was to help the highborn ladies get into their corsets.
Yep. Corseting is just, I've worn one for costumes a few times, and I know that there's some people that actually vouch for their comfort, but like, for me personally, I think maybe I just have weird ribs or I'm an uncomfortable person. I find them very uncomfortable after a while.
Yeah.
I just do.
Yeah, I did tease one at the conferences. There were two young ladies who dressed in period costume, and one was wearing
Hmm.
a corset. And I commented on what it did for her posture. My mother's turning 91 shortly, and even
Hmm.
now when I'm eating with her, she tells me to sit up straight. So I
Yep.
said maybe if I wore a corset, I would finally sit the way she wants me to.
I just sat up straighter in my chair, if anyone was wondering. Whenever someone mentions posture, I think it is a subconscious response. Everyone just kind of that does a quick straighten up in their seats, at least for a few seconds.
Yeah, yeah,
Makes
doesn't
you
last long.
cognizant. No, give me about 2 seconds. I'll have to adjust my mic back down to where I'm slouching. Um, but back to Titanic for the 19th time. Uh, Oh, I forgot my question. Oh, why? I mean, outside of Lightoller and Margaret Brown, are there any passenger survivor or victim that you whose story you learned a detail about that stood out to you in particular?
Oh, well, one that made me cry was about, I can't remember his name now, but the young man, the day the Titanic sank, he turned 17 and
Mm,
was able to wear long trousers for the first time. And he looked very young for his age. And the crew said, you know, you can go ahead and you can get on board one of the lifeboats. And he said, I will stand with the men,
yeah.
and died with the ship. And I just, that was, that just made me, still kind of tears me up when I think about that. I don't remember his name at the moment, but that was very, very touching to me. Uh, and then there's the baker who got so drunk
Yes.
and was so fat that he was one of the six they pulled out of the water and survived. And then I read about one of the stokers when he was rescued. When he got aboard the Carpathia, the first thing he did is he went down to the galley and crawled into an oven that wasn't actively fired to warm up.
Sorry, that's not funny. That's such a move.
Yeah,
Uh, Yikes. I just there's so many fascinating things that happen in the aftermath of stories of like this. And one of those stories in particular, I particularly really like that I've talked about a few times before. It's like, again, these little details of things that are seemingly, I mean, not seemingly, but that some people might ignore was like, I learned about the story of the Paracchio brothers. They worked in the a la carte restaurant, a pair of, young men, Italian. And in a portrait that was taken of them, one of them was wearing a tie and the other was wearing like a silk orchid. When the tie is silk, but I guess you can't really see that. And apparently they were both handmade by their mothers. And she told them to, make sure you wear these, whenever you're feeling happy or when you think of home, or if you get your photo taken so that it'll be in the picture. And there's these two pictures of them, one with the tie and one with the little flower.
uh, oh, one thing that really affected me at the conference is, as you
Hmm.
know, as the ship was sinking, Lightoller sent a bosun down with six of the stokers to open up the second class passage gangway in hopes that the lifeboats could come back and take on additional survivors.
Right.
And they were never seen again. And I learned in the 1986 expedition, they found that door was open.
We did
So
it.
they did complete their final task.
Another sort of bittersweet but heartwarming story is about how none of the postal workers on board Titanic made it off because they were all trying to save the mail.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's There's so many stories of human greatness out of Titanic that I personally think that's another reason that it's so romantically remembered, I think is how I
Yeah.
described it
Yeah.
earlier. Sorry if I'm looking around. The battery on my mouse died, so I'm looking for a battery.
Uh, well, I think the thing is that we ask ourselves, what would I have done in that situation? We compare ourselves to the actions of some who died and some who survived, and wonder how we would have measured up. So I think
Right.
that's part of the fascination as well.
I think so too. And it's just one of those things where you'll never know. You could train for something your whole life, but until it happens, you never know what's going to happen. Like for a somewhat lighthearted example, I mentioned I play roller derby. If you're not familiar with roller derby, it's two teams. Each field's five people per, let's call it a round for simplicity. One on each team is a point scorer, and they just kind of have to go around and around and around. And they get points for every member of the opposing team they pass, which obviously means the opposing team is like, let's not let her pass. Let's just hold the line. Very Lord of the Rings. And we practice all kinds of things like this is how you catch someone when they're coming at you, and this is how you get them out of bounds. And there's been more than one time where during a game, my brain just goes completely blank as I see that point score coming and I just watch them go. Oh, look, there they come. Oh, there they go. And I just didn't move. Stood right there.
Well, that's because you don't have a killer instinct.
I guess, I guess not. But in my brain, it's like I know what I'm supposed to do, but every once in a while, you just sort of freeze up.
Yeah. Well, if it comes comes at you quickly, you don't
Hmm.
have really time to analyze it. That's why in baseball they taught us. So I played second base. So when the batter's up and say there's somebody on first base, you think, okay, if the ball comes to me, this is what I'll do. So you've already thought it through
Hmm.
before the pitcher makes the throw. So if it winds up coming to you, you've already worked through that, and it's instinct. You don't, because you think you get the ball and now what am I going to do? Then if you do that, then both runners get on base and uh, and you lost a chance to put somebody out.
Yeah. Excuse me. Oh my goodness. I'm so sorry.
It's all right.
It's a hell of water. Yeah, no, it's this just goes, back to commending people on the Titan. I mean, I'm sure there's people that froze up for a second, but there's just so many more stories of people that not only didn't freeze up, but immediately launched into action. Like Charles Jockin, even though he was very drunk, was throwing stuff overboard and trying to find ways to save people. And
Yeah.
Murdoch was running himself all up and down the starboard side, loading people into lifeboats. And Jack Phillips refused to leave the Marconi room because he was trying to send out messages, and the postal workers didn't want to leave their post, and the electricians kept the lights on, and this and that, and this and that. There's so many stories of people overriding their fears to respond in incredibly calm, rational, and stoic ways.
Yeah.
And you don't always see that. There's always incredible stories of heroism that come out of things, but this was a very high proportion of heroism.
Yeah, to me, it's fascinating the contrast between Captain Lord of the California and Captain Rostron of the Carpathia. How those two men reacted in a very similar situation. Lord didn't want to be bothered. Oh, there's rockets going off. I don't care what color are they. White. Okay, fine. We'll go back to
Hmm.
sleep. And
Sure.
Rostron, as soon as he gets the radio message, I mean, he was. Thank God, he was such a good leader,
Yeah.
very efficient. They weren't nearly as fast as the Titanic, but going at their full speed through an ice field at night to try to get there as quickly as possible, doing everything they possibly could, and everything they did to prepare to take on the survivors well before they ever got close. I mean, he was really the right person at the right time, and
Yeah.
the only non-American to ever get a Congressional Medal of Honor, the only civilian to ever get a Congressional Medal of Honor, and I think certainly deserved it.
I would actually really like to see a movie or miniseries about the rescue of the Titanic told from the story of the Carpathia and Arthur Rostrom.
That would be I like that a lot. Everyone's focused on the Titanic and the Carpathia is kind of an afterthought, but I think you're right. I think that would make for a very good story.
Yeah, I mean, maybe it didn't I haven't researched the Carpathia, so nobody at me about this in particular. I haven't really looked into the demographics of who was aboard the Carpathia, but I assume that you could also have a similar sort of a societal style drama to begin with a little bit of character building intrigue. But I do think that the story of the rescue, and again, aboard the Carpathia, how everyone just kind of leapt into business. They were told that there is an emergency and we need you all to act accordingly. And everyone said, yes, sir.
Yeah.
That's incredible to me. Oh, I randomly decided to look it up. The young man that you mentioned who stood back with the men because he had just turned 17. His name was Alfred George John Rush. Alfred Rush. He was a third class passenger. He was 17 years and 1 day old when he passed.
Yeah.
Speaking of people who just did what they thought was right. And
Yeah.
it is incredible to hear so many stories of people overriding their survival instincts because they're very strong.
Yeah.
I don't know that I'd be able to stay. I'm thinking of a modern day equivalent, stay here and continue typing out emergency messages if there was water at my waist. I think I'd leave.
Yeah, yeah. The wireless operators were very, very dedicated young men. It was unusual that they had two on there, so they get a 24-hour operation. That
Hmm.
was one of the major problems. By the time they were sending out the messages, a lot of the ships in the area, their operators had already gone to bed for the night, so
Yeah.
we're not able to pick that up. One of the things that that always confused me was why Captain Smith went at such high speed, even with the report of ice. And I've just recently found out that around shortly before 4 o'clock that afternoon, he actually had the ship turn to a more southerly bearing
Hmm.
to try to avoid the bulk of the ice. And that way, just going full speed ahead. And yeah, we're going to just go around the ice field. It was a good thought. One of the problems was it got him out of the most heavily traveled lane of traffic, and so again reduced the number of ships that were immediately nearby that could have responded to the disaster.
Yeah. It's it's eh, it's sad to look back on these things and think, wouldn't it be so easy if you hadn't did that, or wouldn't it have been better if this didn't happen? And that's also the frustrating thing about looking back on all these disasters again with our 2023 superior knowledge and thinking, well, why would you do something silly like that? Why would you make a dumb decision like that? Why were you so risky? What is wrong with you? And maybe he was just being risky and didn't care. I have no idea. I don't know this guy.
Yeah,
I don't know Captain Smith or that much about him, but there's so many things to look at and think if only it had been just a little different.
yeah, yeah. Just yeah. And I say if the lookouts had been a little bit faster, they could have avoided the iceberg altogether. If they'd been
Hmm.
a little bit slower, it would have hit head on. Then that would have been a survivable event. At most, you would have flooded two compartments, and it could survive having up to four compartments flooded. But the fact that they responded just quick enough to scrape along the side instead of hitting it straight on was what sealed its fate.
Yeah, and there's so many other things you can say. Like if they were going slower, they would have gotten there later in the day. Maybe the sun would have started coming up. You would have been able to see.
Yeah, yeah.
So many things you can say. You should have, if this shoulda, coulda, woulda.
Yeah. Well, if the SS America had collided with the Titanic just as it was pulling out, the stern line on the America broke,
Hmm.
and they said it got within 4 feet of hitting the Titanic, and it was in the river test, and it was going at low speed, and it couldn't navigate, couldn't move out of the way, and if a tugboat hadn't got there just in time, there would have been a collision, and if nothing else, that would have delayed the departure just for inspection.
Yep. So many things, so many things that could have happened that didn't. And if there hadn't have been a coal strike, if there hadn't have been this, if there
Yeah,
had been this, if there had been the binoculars, if there hadn't been a cruise switch, who you don't know.
yeah.
So many ways of knowing. If there'd been a crew switch, then it would have been Lightoller on duty at that time. Would it have gone better or worse? You never know.
Never know.
Never know. But I just checked my timer that I do need to have running, and I am very pleased with myself. This has not been like a 3 hour thing that I let get away from me. Because I could easily talk to you for an extremely long time. I find, as I mentioned, I'm fascinated by true crime. I love writing. And I love comics. Before I let you go, there is one thing that I want to just emphasize to everyone is that the comic is based on a poem and it is short, but I think that you read it. Comics take so much time and effort to produce that I think it's a little easily dismissed because of how quick they are to consume. But they're really, really intensive works of love and collaboration, and I do think that more people should read it. Bradley, what is the title of this wonderful comic?
It's called Dark Tryst,
Mm.
Dark, dark, and then Tryst is Tryst.
Mm-hmm.
And it's available on Amazon.
Mm-hmm.
Bradley Harper is my author name, and you can look at the other books or other things I've produced as well. I've got the audiobooks. The first audiobook of my Jack the Ripper story won Earphone Award from Audiophile Magazine, and I'm proud
Hmm.
to say that A Knife in the Fog is a recommended read by the Arthur Conan Doyle estate.
Cool. Oh, very cool.
Yeah.
Yes, go ahead and check that out. Go ahead and check out A Knife in the Dark, and Reflections in a Dragon's Eye, which is coming out by the time you hear this. It will already be out, so go ahead and pick up a copy of that. And keep your eyes out, hopefully in the next couple years, maybe for Maiden Voyage.
All right. Well,
That would
thank
be
you very
awesome.
much.
Thank you.